Hi fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to March. Today is going to be probably a bumper edition because I've got the most important thing that you'll ever hear about fantasy fiction to tell you. It's part of my ongoing series about writing your first fantasy fiction novel, but this is important stuff. You need to hear it, so stick around because in the second part of this show, I'll be telling you the most important thing you'll ever hear about fantasy fiction and about writing fantasy fiction. But first, like I say, welcome to March, welcome to spring. Hopefully later in March I'll do a little thing about spring. But I just wanted to pick up on a piece I was talking about last week. If you remember, in last week's show, I was talking about Charles Dickens, and I was asking whether he was the first really enterprising entrepreneur who ever came along. And interestingly, I picked up on a news story from this weekend. It was printed in the Sunday Times, which said that reading Charles Dickens is good for your mental health. So I thought it illustrated a little bit about what I was talking about last week, and it tells you a little bit more about Charles Dickens. Now, the findings which have emerged in a new book that's been published by Oxford University Press suggests that challenging language can send rocket boosters into your brain, and these rocket boosters improve mental health. So unusual phrases and unfamiliar words in great works of fiction tend to command undivided attention in a reader. And these thought-provoking moments will aid self-reflection, and they'll help shift a brain into what the psychologists call a higher gear. Now, a chap named Philip Davies, who's the Emeritus Professor of English Literature at the University of Liverpool and is the author of Reading for Life, has said that the great works of literature, for example, works by Charles Dickens, free the emotion and the imagination, and they can make somebody feel more alive. The Centre for Research into Reading, Literature and Society, and whose abbreviations is CRILS, C-R-I-L-S, hooked up some readers to brain scanners, and they monitored their brain patterns whilst they read Dickens and Shakespeare. And the amazing thing is that Professor Davis said that you could actually see the brain coming to life when these readers read Dickens and Shakespeare. So after seeing that reading could re-engage people with mild or even moderate dementia, he said that he hoped there would be a wider promotion of reading to dementia patients in care homes. And if you remember, I said last week that a lot of the poorer people in Dickens' society back in the Victorian days, they couldn't read. They didn't know how to read. But readers went around reading them the stories. So there's no reason why they can't enjoy the story. And there's no reason why people in care homes can't enjoy the story. Anyway, Zoe Gilling, who's a director at The Reader, that is a charity that has assisted the CRILS people in their studies and runs reading groups to community centres and at libraries and in care homes, hospitals and prisons. She said, great literature has the power to touch diverse people and illuminate what connects us. It can help with inner life and mental health and soul troubles. And it can make us say that I never knew that anyone else but me felt that way. And that has to be a good thing. So, Charles Dickens, reading Charles Dickens is good for your mental health. So, in my series on writing your first ever fantasy fiction novel, I've got to the point where I need to tell you the most important thing you'll ever hear about fantasy fiction. And it's this. Are you ready? I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain it all to you, but the important thing is, what I'm going to tell you now is what is magic? What is magical? So one of the best things about being a fantasy author is creating your own magic. You're given a free license by the reader to come up with anything you want, and it doesn't even have to be within reason. In fact, the wilder your imagination is, the more rewarding the experience will be for the fantasy fiction fan. Now, if you've been listening to the show all this while, right from episode 1, you'll probably be saying, huh? But that's counterintuitive, ain't it? Don't you keep saying that the fantasy world corresponds with the real world? Don't you keep saying that the real world situations and the histories and the mythologies are what underpin fantasy stories? And yes, you're right. The answer is I do. But any brainy psychologists out there will support me, I hope, when I tell you that sometimes the strangest, the freakiest and the most bizarrest guff that comes out of your brain when it's at rest. That means that even in your most wildest and most fanciful dreams, the stuff which comes out is basically the consequences of repressed desires, or is informed or inspired by traumas that you've faced or you've suffered in the real world. If you don't believe me on this, take a look at the paintings by Hieronymus Bosch or the stuff that was produced by English artist Richard Dadd. Look at that stuff and then tell me if they didn't have repressed desires. Now I've said that, I have to make a big grumble, and this grumble is also a lament. And it's this. What happens to all the imagination in the universe? Because, I'll be honest with you, it's the only thing we've got as a species. It's the only thing which marks us out as different and unique as a species. Without imagination, we are merely cyber gorillas. Because here we are in AD 2020 with more fantasy fiction writers than ever before, and with millions of eager readers all wanting to get their eyes on new myth and magic stories. And what do they get to read? I'll tell you what they get to read. They get a whole load of old tropes. Witches, mages, dragons, elves, castles, princesses. You know they do. This is the truth. I call these things gobbledygook cliches. In fact, some writers, how dare they, I say, have even been reimagining classic fairy stories, and they've been paid oodles for these classic fairy stories, and they've even been heartily slapped on the back and rewarded thousands for their amazing work. And I say, what's going on? Don't any of you have an ounce of inventiveness and ingenuity in your noggin anymore? Don't you believe in make-believe? To me, those people are no more than copy typists. How dare they claim to be story fabricators? Yes, they may be clever wordsmiths and they may have thought of a good way to make a buck, but they're just puppeteers. They're just going through a bunch of well-worn scripts that have been handed down to them by somebody who's much more imaginative than them, and they've just taken those words, fiddled about with them, and then reproduced something else. It's like sticking the words of Hans Christian Andersen in a food processor and seeing what the result is. So that's my gripe. You can hear the anger in my voice. But all positives come from complaints, don't they? I think we can turn any gripe into an initiative and intervention. So that's what I want to do today. I want to tell you what your job is as a fantasy fiction writer, and then I want you to come up with your own magic. And that's why I say this is the most important lesson you'll ever hear. Your job as a fantasy fiction writer is to come up with your own magic. And I want to help you, and I want to give you some tools that will bring about a magical mindset. But first, I want to ask this question. Why is the world's first billionaire author, J.K. Rowling, so successful? Is it because she's an amazing literary force? I think it's because she develops amazingly inventive ideas, although they are fixed within a world we can totally understand, and her themes are about relatable things like bigotry. She comes up with an originative and witty way to tell her story. And it's the same with Stephen King, and it's the same with the much missed Terry Pratchett. But go back to J.K. Rowling, thinking about her Dementors and her Thestrals and her Bogarts in the Harry Potter universe. Ask yourself this. Have you ever conjured up anything that's so fanciful as those creatures? So I challenge you, come on, conceptualise the hell out of your next creation, astonish yourself, and most of all, fantasise. Because your job as a fantasist is to come up with bewonderment for the reader. That's why J.K. Rowling and Terry Pratchett and Stephen King are successful, is because they come up with bewonderment. So, I said I'll give you some tools on how to kickstart the imaginative process. In order to do that, you must tap into what the psychologists call your unconscious fantasy. And to do that, you must indulge in what they call play activity. This is the activity that goes on when a person plays inside their own mind. If you think about it, in the first months of being born, a child isn't really playing with any objects, it's playing within its own mind. This is the beginning of unconscious fantasy. But first, let's have a look at what is magical anyway. I want you, as I go through this list, to think about the Dementors and the Thestrals and the Bogarts in Harry Potter's universe and test them against what I'm going to say next. Because this is what I think magical is. Like I said, this is the most important lesson you'll ever learn, and nobody's ever done a list of what's magical before. So here goes. Number 1, phenomenal. It is something that's unrealistic or ludicrously odd. Magical is symbolic. In other words, it serves as a visible symbol for something that's abstract. Magical is transpersonal. That means its existence lays beyond the conscious limits of a person's identity. Magic is metaphysical. That means it's something without form or substance. Magic is synesthetic. That means it relates to more than one sense, or it can only be experienced outside the normal senses. Magic is providential. That means it's given by divine providence or some amazing good fortune. Magic is miraculous. That means it must be impossible to explain by science. Magic is mysterious. That means it must be beyond normal understanding. And finally, magic has to be cryptical. In other words, there has to be an obscure or hidden meaning. Now, if you test things like the Dementors against those, you'll see that they tick some of those boxes and maybe some they don't. The important thing is that if you tick one or some of those boxes, you've created something that's magical. But there's problems. There's problems for us fantasy fiction writers who live in the 21st century, and they're twofold. Number 1, we're surrounded by magic. And number 2, we've lost our connection with what's called the transmundane. And that is the things which exist outside or beyond our physical world. So let me examine those two thoughts in more detail. First of all, we are surrounded by magic. Last week I read that Whitney Houston, who died in 2012, is currently undertaking a comeback tour. The Whitney Houston hologram tour features a very convincing hologram of Whitney, who plays the part of the American singer on this concert tour. They say that holographic technology is now so good that only an expert can tell the difference between a hologram and the real thing. We have self-driving cars, we have 3D printing, we can see a person's face on a handheld device. Even though he or she might be on the other side of the world, we can talk to that person in real time. We can pick up and hold a device that contains 1 million books. The magic that surrounds us is endless. And all these little things, some of which, or many of which we take for granted, would have been thought of as magic by previous generations. What would Charles Dickens have thought if he'd seen a hologram of himself on stage? What would he have thought of self-driving cars and 3D printers? So the snag is, we are muggles, but our lives are surrounded by literal and graspable magic. So in fact, we're not muggles, we're lost muggles. We're surrounded by magic, but we can't see what's truly ineffable. We can't see the wood for the trees. Now, this becomes a problem if our job is to be Imagineers. If our job is to create other worlds, then it becomes a problem if we're lost muggles and we can't see the truly ineffable. The second part of what I think is our problem is that we've lost our connection with the transmundane. Now, Let me ask you a few questions. When did you last go to church? When did you last meditate? When did you last say a prayer? When did you last contemplate the meaning of life? When did you ruminate on your own existence? Now, hooray, many of you probably said every day, or, oh yes, I do that once a week, and good for you. And I'm sure you've been very good and you need a pat on the back. But if you didn't say yes to any of those questions, then there's a good chance that you might be losing your connection with the natural rhythms of the universe. You might be out of touch with yourself, and you might be losing your interrelationship with the transmundane. So because of that, I want you to try these steps to stimulate your unconscious fantasy. You don't have to do these every day, but it's a good idea to form these as a habit. You don't have to do all of them, but try some. Number 1, allow yourself to daydream. Try to voyage to fantastical places. Number 2, let yourself get bored and doodle as you let your mind go blank. Number 3, listen to classical music or a type of music you don't normally listen to, maybe jazz. And then write some notes about what you heard. Try to explain what you heard using other senses, for example, colours and textures. Write a short poem about something that has caught your eye today. Create a constellation. How many stars are in this constellation? What's the shape of it? Does it look like a crab? Does it look like a goat? Or does it look like some other object that you've just created out of your mind? And what are the star names? If your constellation has 20 stars, name them. Use a magnifying glass to look at something really small. Then write a description. Write a description of your favourite meal, but use all of the 5 senses. Dream up a new colour and tell me what the colour is, and tell me how or where you would find this colour. Now, go back to my earlier list of what is magical and test your characters and your heroes and your fantastic beasts against the list. Are they phenomenal? Are they symbolic? Do they serve as a symbol for something that's abstract? Are they transpersonal? In other words, are they beyond the conscious limits of a person's identity? Are they metaphysical? Are they, in other words, without form or substance? Are they synesthetic? In other words, do they relate to more than one sense, or do they experience something that lies outside the normal senses? Are they providential? In other words, are they given to us by some kind of deity or amazing good fortune? Are they miraculous? In other words, are they impossible to explain by modern science? Are they mysterious? In other words, are they beyond normal understanding? And are they cryptical? In other words, do they have an obscure or hidden meaning? If no, if your characters or your heroes or your fantastic beasts don't tick one or more of the boxes, then you need to ask yourself an evaluative question. Is what I have written so far truly magical? Hi fantasy fiction fans, and thank you so much for keeping up with the month-long study of the classical Romans. And we've come towards the end now, and it's the Roman invasion of Britannia. And I told you it was a big subject, but I wanted to cover it all. And to me, this is the final part of the Roman story, because when the Romans did invade Britain, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a moment, they took off more than they could chew. They had to leave in Britain a standing army, a quite large standing army. This was a drain on the resources of the Roman Empire. It was a continuous and lengthy drain on the resources of the Roman Empire. And whilst they kept their standing army in Britain, it meant that they didn't protect other areas which were then attacked and overwhelmed by other so-called barbarian forces. So I think, number 1, it was a completely futile invasion. Number 2, it was very costly for the Roman Empire. And number 3, it brought about, I'm not saying it was the direct result, but it certainly brought about the end of the Roman civilization, even though in or in part 1 of my series, I did say that we were still living inside the Roman civilization. But anyway, to talk about the Roman invasion of Britannia, we do need to discuss the Celts, because that's who lived in Britain before the Romans got here. And the first thing to understand about the Celts is that there was no such thing as the Celts. As I've already said in previous shows, before the Romans existed, Europe and the Mediterranean lands were populated by tribes of what I like to call native Indians. They had existed since the time we call the New Stone Age, the Neolithic period, and they probably originated from nomadic Proto-Indian European peoples who probably migrated out of the area that we now know as northern Iran and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan when they followed the herds. They followed the herds into the larger plain areas of Europe, and that's how they got here, and then they expanded out from there. These original peoples were hunter-gatherers to begin with, but they soon developed lowland farming practices, and they eventually developed bronze and other metalworking technologies, and they formed profitable trading alliances with each other and networks of overland trade routes using wheeled transport. And these trade routes spanned across Eurasia. But like I said, there was no such thing as the Celts. They certainly wouldn't describe themselves as Celts, and unfortunately, because they have no written language, we have no direct history about them. We only have accounts written by others, opinionated and prejudicial competitors, if you like. We only know about them through their enemies, and that's never a good way to learn about somebody. But what we do know is that the Celtic regions were huge. The Celts populated the area we now know as France, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Slovakia, Hungary, Ukraine, northern Italy, western Russia, northern Spain, Portugal, parts of Turkey, bits of the Middle East, and importantly for this show, for the subject matter of this show, the British Isles. Now, it's thought that the centre of the Celtic population, if there ever was such a thing, was probably a place called Hallstatt, which is in Austria, and it can be found in the Salzkammergut region. But the population panned out over almost the entire landmass of Europe, and as I've said, they utilised the Atlantic seaboard to populate the islands of Britain too. But after military aventurism by Rome, the Celtic Empire, the one I've just told you about, which spanned across the whole of Europe and sort of probably started out from Hallstatt, was reduced to just a few isolated pockets of community, and these were found in the British Isles, specifically Cornwall, Ireland, Wales, Isle of Man and some Scottish islands, or on remote promontories in places like Britannia and Normandy and northern Spain. All the rest, all the evidence of this huge, expansive Celtic civilization disappeared. And there's a reason for that. It's because the Romans comprehensively erased it. They laid cities to waste, they destroyed artworks, they destroyed religious artifacts, they stole and melted down all the gold, and they rewrote the history of the Celts to satisfy their own ego. Now, the first recorded use of the word Celt to describe these European peoples was from a Greek geographer named Hecataeus of Miletus in about 517 BC, and he encountered what he called Celts near modern Marseille in southern France. But the ancient Greeks also wrote about them being at the head of the Danube, so we know that the Greeks understood that the Celts were very widespread and they spread across the entire continent of Europe. And incidentally, the Greeks traded with them. Celts means the tall ones, by the way. Julius Caesar reported that the people known to the Romans as Gauls actually were Celts too. So when you read the word Gaul, you can assume it's a synonym for Celt. The best way to get your head around the Celts is to imagine that they are a family of like-minded peoples who spoke a similar, but no, not exactly the same language, and had similar, although not exactly the same, cultures. But, like I've said before, and I'll say it again, there was no such thing as the Celts. They didn't think of themselves as the Celts. So why did Rome invade Britannia? Well, the territory held by the Celts across Europe was rich in tin, lead, iron, silver and gold. Celtic smiths and metalworkers were plentiful and highly skilled, and they created ornate weapons and intricate jewellery for international trade. They particularly liked to trade with the Romans. Celtic societies had a complex and rather brilliant monetary system. What we might call coins had for them a dual use, because their coins were also rings and bells and belt buckles and other small useful objects. If you can imagine monopoly tokens like the car and the boot and the dog, you can get your head around that. So a goat, for example, in Celtic times might be worth 5 rings, 2 bells and the buckle, do you see? But the Celts also minted high-value silver and gold coins, and it's thought that the Romans swiped the idea when they instituted their own coinage. The Celts fought with long-bladed swords and were well known to be headhunters, and they were also well known to be extremely fierce warriors. And they followed a variety of pagan gods that seemed alien to the Romans. So I'll quickly go through the Celtic pantheon of gods. In the Celtic pantheon you would find such gods as Tautatis. He was similar to Greek Hermes or Mercury, he was similar to Greek Ares or Mars, and he was known as the protector of the tribes. You'll note that he was not a protector of one particular tribe, but he was protector of all Celtic tribes. And there was also Taranis, the god of thunder, who was remembered by the symbol of the 6 or sometimes 8-spoked chariot wheel. And this is believed to be a symbol of the sun chariot, as opposed to the war chariot that was used by Celtic tribes. This was a symbol of the sun chariot that was used by the sky deity as he rode across the sky to bring light into the world. And also in the pantheon was Luchus or Luf, who was a 3-faced god whose emblem was a chicken or cockerel, which is now incidentally the emblem of France, because their history goes right back to the Gauls, who, if you remember, are Celts. But he was also symbolised by other birds, in particular the crow, and he was identified as an important deity for crafters and for leather workers and for merchants. He was often portrayed with a goddess called the Great Provider, and he was often portrayed holding bags of money and with a spear. Inspired by the thought of getting their hands on these mountains of gold and silver and exploiting the Celtic mining operations by enslaving the workers and then hoarding all the jewellery for themselves, the money-grabbing Romans set out to overpower and subjugate the Celtic tribes. The Roman view was that the Celts were owners and operators of large-scale mining operations. They were owners and operators of amazingly complex agricultural advances. They were owners and operators of mercantile infrastructures and complex trading networks. And they had some sophisticated towns and cities as well. For example, some of the Celtic towns in the area we now know as southern Germany were already 4 times the size of Rome. So all these advances not only presented an impediment to Roman expansion, but also, more importantly, seemed to suggest that the Celts had a lot more treasure than Rome had, and Rome wanted it. So they started with the sacking of the Gauls, and Julius Caesar launched what was known as the Gallic Wars in 58 BC. And he'd conquered the whole of Gaul by 51 BC. And he used the gold he'd captured to pay off debts and to fund other military expeditions that might boost his political career. And part of these Gallic Wars, and remember, Gauls is synonym for Celts, was the conquest of the westernmost Celtic lands. And where are the westernmost Celtic lands? Britannia. So, in 55 and 54 BC, and as part of his Gallic conquests, Julius Caesar attempted his most ambitious and ultimately most costly and futile of military ventures when he invaded the home of the Britannic tribes. Now, according to Caesar, the Britannic tribes had been overrun and culturally assimilated by other Celtic tribes during the British Iron Age, and had since then been aiding Caesar's enemy. This gave him the excuse to attack. Now, he invaded Britain twice, once in 55 and once in 54. On the first occasion, it was little more than an intelligence-gathering operation. He took with him just 2 legions and achieved little beyond a landing on the coast of Kent, in the area, by the way, which I described in last week's show, in the area known as the Isle of Thanet. The second invasion, in 54, consisted of 628 ships, 5 legions, 2,000 cavalry, and was such an imposing force that the Britannic tribes waited for his armies to move inland before they attacked. And when they attacked, they used chariots, war chariots, to slow down the Roman advance. And these war chariots were a novelty to the Romans, who had never come across them before. Of course, some tribes surrendered to Caesar, some made agreements with him and signed pledges to him, but others formed a consortium and decided to defeat him. And how they decided to defeat him was by cutting off his supply route, because he was supplied through the Canty-held territory, the area now known as Kent. If you cut off his supply route, he can't operate. Directly, they did cut off his supply route. He had to retreat back to his landing places. Caesar wrote to Cicero to confirm the result of this second campaign, and the result was some hostages, no booty, and we're returning to Gaul, leaving no occupying forces. In other words, the invasion of Britannia was a defeat. Nevertheless, back home, Julius Caesar made much of his success in gaining valuable intelligence about the Britannic tribes, and he probably bigged up the British wealth and the British military skills and the general irrepressible nature of the Britons that he found. He probably exaggerated their military prowess to save face. He also commented on the Druid class, that's the priestly class, who he said were the most high-ranking class of the ancient culture. He described these much respected Druids as sorcerers and seers, and he said that they played an important part in Celtic society. Julius Caesar claimed they were responsible for organising worship and sacrifices, divination and judicial procedure. Druidic law, don't forget that Celts did not write anything down, Druidic law consisted of a large number of verses that had to be learnt parrot fashion, and Julius Caesar remarked that it might take 20 years to complete a course of Druidic study. He also made reference to the Druids as practitioners of the despicable act of human sacrifice, which was, of course, coming a bit rich from a civilization that regularly crucified its victims and enjoyed gladiatorial fights to the death in their theatres back home. Most of his accusations and his exaggerations have since been debunked by historians, but it left in the minds of Caesar's supporters and later his successors, this retreat from Britannia in 54 was an undignified backslide for the Roman military forces, and they ought to be reversed as soon as the opportunity came up. Furthermore, it kind of underlines the possibility that Britannia was filled with silver, it was populated by madmen, run by weirdos. Weirdos, incidentally, who had a penchant for painting themselves blue and in indulging in human sacrifice. And all these falsehoods couldn't be proven or otherwise until Britannia was reconquered. So it was commonly held in Rome that it was a matter of honour to go back and at some point finish off the Britons and finish off the job that Julius Caesar had failed to do. But it's worth, before I move to Emperor Claudius, it's worth noting that the Roman conquest of Britannia was a gradual process. Augustus Caesar prepared invasions in 34 BC, in 27 BC and 25 BC, and all of those were called off. And Caligula planned a campaign against Britannia in AD 40, but he ordered his forces to gather seashells on the coast at northern France in Boulogne. Nobody knows why he ordered them to do that, but he called off the planned invasion as well. So it wasn't until AD 43 that Emperor Claudius used the excuse of being asked by a client king to provide a peacekeeping force to Britannia, and he was invited over to provide that peacekeeping force. It wasn't until 43 that the Romans properly came back. And, like I've just tried to hint at, it wasn't even a conquest to begin with. It soon became a fierce war, but it was just a peacekeeping act. You know, Rome pretended to be United Nation forces, and they were going across there just to keep the peace. We would now describe the Roman invasion of Britannia in AD 43 as part of their peacetime operations. Anyway, the peacetime operations did become a conquest, and that conquest was largely completed by 87 AD. The Romans originally landed in Kent, just like before, but later amphibious landings also took place at Boxgrove and Hengistbury, and these were either side of the Isle of Wight, and also on the edges of Essex. And this meant that the Roman troops, when they moved forward, they encountered tribes such as the Canti, which are in Kent, the Atrebati, which are in Sussex and Hampshire, the Iceni, who were from Norfolk, the Trinovantes from Essex, and the Cativoloni, who led the resistance against the conquest and who lived north of the Thames in the area we now know as Hertfordshire. The mighty Roman military machine kind of got stuck at the River Trent, which was in the North Midlands, and then they hit a snag with Boudicca, who led an Iceni revolt, and she used neighbouring Trinovantes warriors in a large-scale attack, which eventuated in the sacking of Colchester, which was a major Roman base, Londinium, which wasn't as big as London is now, it was basically a small town, and St Albans. So it wasn't until Governor Agricola, who served between 78 and 84, that the Romans established control of the north, and that is right up to the Scottish borders. You will have heard of Hadrian's Wall, and it features in the mythology of George R.R. Martin, the wall which separates the north from the south. It separates civilization from uncivilization. Under Hadrian, the Roman occupation was withdrawn to a defendable frontier at Hadrian's Wall, which was constructed around about AD 122. In 142, an attempt was made to push the frontier north to the River Clyde, River Forth area, where they built the Antonine Wall. But this was abandoned because they just couldn't hold on to it, and the Romans returned. They retreated back to Hadrian's Wall. That drain eventuated in the collapse of their empire, the Roman invasion of Britain.